What if the life you sacrificed everything for, the life you believed was your destiny, turned out to be built on a foundation of shadows and lies? Picture this: a prince who once stood proudly shoulder to shoulder with his brother at the very heart of the most powerful monarchy on earth. A man shaped by duty, tradition, and history, now sitting in isolation inside a grand mansion in Montecito, California. There he is, staring out at the choices that may have shattered the very family he once swore, with unwavering conviction, he would never abandon. Prince Harry, once remembered as the mischievous young royal, the dedicated soldier, the grieving boy walking behind his mother's coffin, has become the runaway duke. He traded centuries of royal heritage and the weight of tradition for the shimmering promise of freedom, love, and happiness. Yet here lies the cruel twist behind the glossy magazine covers, behind the carefully orchestrated interviews and dazzling headlines. Harry quietly admitted something that changes the entire story. He confessed that the decision to abandon his royal life was not entirely his own. It was not fully his choice. With that single admission, everything shifts. The narrative of Harry and Meghan Markle, the fairy tale that enchanted the world, begins to unravel. Let me ask you directly, have you ever believed you were making a decision that would shape your life forever, only to realise much later that perhaps it was never truly your decision at all, that the voice you thought was your own had been drowned out by another louder and more insistent, pressing harder until you surrendered? That is the essence of Harry's confession. He never truly wanted to walk away, not completely, not in the abrupt and final way it unfolded. But Meghan ensured that he did. And let me be clear, this is not the stuff of idle speculation or tabloid gossip. This is something Harry has reportedly admitted in moments of candour to those closest to him. A private truth that, once revealed, exposes the fractures in the love story that once captivated the entire world. Tonight, we will unravel it, slowly, piece by piece, layer by layer, from the fairy tale wedding that seemed to promise a new dawn to the fiery arguments that tore at the seams from the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace to the sprawling yet lonely estates of Montecito. Because if Harry's regret is real, then it alters not just his own story, not just the narrative of a marriage, but perhaps even the very future of the monarchy itself. Let us rewind for a moment. Do you remember the day when Harry and Meghan stood proudly on the steps of St. George's Chapel? Their hands were clasped tightly together, their smiles wide and radiant, as if the entire world had blessed their union. The church bells rang out with power, the crowds roared with joy, and the cameras captured what so many believed was the dawn of a brand new royal era. It looked and felt like a perfect fairy tale, didn't it? A young prince daring to break centuries of barriers, marrying an American actress. A woman of mixed heritage, who seemed to embody progress and modernity for a family so often accused of clinging to traditions of the past. And yet behind that carefully rehearsed and polished smile, tiny but undeniable seeds of doubt were already being planted. For even as Harry celebrated with joy, Meghan was quietly preparing an escape, preparing a carefully crafted narrative, preparing for a life far beyond the rigid and imposing palace walls. Now, why does this story still matter today? Because those cracks that were once invisible are no longer hidden. They are widening for the world to see. The whispers are growing louder. People are beginning to recognise what Harry himself has begun to hint at in private moments, that perhaps he was not entirely free in his decision, that perhaps he was manipulated, cornered, and ultimately pushed into abandoning the very identity that had defined him from birth. And those whispers, once confined to secret conversations behind closed doors, are threatening to break into the open with a force that cannot be contained. Consider the timing. Meghan and Harry's once celebrated business deals are faltering public sympathy that once shielded them is slipping away, and rumours swirl relentlessly that their marriage is under intense strain. And at the very centre of this storm, Harry admits something devastating regret. Not just regret over the cruelty of the tabloids, not merely regret about the backlash and criticism, but regret about the single life-altering choice that reshaped not only his own path, but the destiny of his entire family forever. Now, let us pause and consider this carefully. Let me ask you directly, if you were in Harry's place, if you were the boy who had lost his mother to the relentless pursuit of the press, a child scarred by tragedy and raised under the constant gaze of the world, would you truly choose to abandon the protection of your family, the structure of the institution, the very framework that had given your life meaning? Or would it require the steady persuasion, the unyielding insistence of someone else to finally push you over the edge? And that is exactly where Meghan steps into the story. According to what Harry confided to close friends, even in moments when doubt gnawed at him, even when hesitation weighed heavily on his heart, Meghan remained relentless. She painted vivid pictures of a life of freedom, of independence, of a fresh beginning under the California Sunday. Yet behind that glittering picture lay something far more complex: pressure manipulation and the calculated use of emotional leverage. Harry did not want to be seen as the villain. He did not want to disappoint her, to appear weak or unloving, and so in the end he gave in. And here is where the contradiction takes hold. Harry truly believed he was breaking free. He believed he was choosing love over the weight of duty. He believed with conviction that he was carving out a life on his own terms. But what if, in reality, he had not broken free at all? What if he had simply exchanged one cage for another? Because now in Montecito, surrounded by high walls and watchful security guards, Harry has begun to feel the very thing he once thought. He had escaped the suffocating sense of being trapped. Does that not sound like the cruelest irony imaginable? The boy who once described the palace as a gilded cage now finds himself imprisoned again, only this time the walls are of his own making, or perhaps more truthfully, of Meghan's design. And that is what makes his whispered confession so devastating, so explosive. Because if Harry admits he never truly wanted to leave, then it reveals something few ever realised: Meghan orchestrated the departure. It was not a partnership. It was not a decision made equally. It was not mutual at all. It was pressure. It was persuasion. It was manipulation, carefully carried out until there was no turning back. And now, as the dust slowly begins to settle, Harry finds himself haunted by the enormity of what he left behind: his family, his ancestral home, his heritage, and above all, the enduring legacy of his mother. Imagine for a moment the crushing weight of guilt that comes with realising you may have betrayed not only your brother and your father, but even the memory of Diana herself, the very figure you once vowed to honour with every choice is made. And that is why this story matters so deeply. Because this is not simply about a celebrity marriage played out under the glare of cameras. This is history. This is the monarchy. This is the story of a man torn violently between love and loyalty, who is now realising, perhaps far too late, that he may have chosen the wrong path. But before we rush too far ahead, let us set the stage with care. Tonight, we will peel back the layers and examine the moments that led Harry to his regret, the private arguments that shook his confidence, the bitter family fights that left scars, the hushed confessions whispered only in the darkest hours of the night. We will see how Meghan slowly yet skillfully crafted the idea that leaving was not merely an option, but the only option. And we will uncover the heavy consequences that Harry never foresaw until it was too late. Yet, let me warn you clearly, this is not the fairy tale you have been sold. This is the hidden story, the untold narrative. And once you hear it in its raw truth, you may never look at Harry and Meghan in quite the same way again. Because here lies the brutal reality. Blind love can intoxicate, but love can also be sharpened into a weapon. And for Harry, that very weapon may have cost him everything. Still, the question refuses to fade away. If Harry now regrets leaving, what does that mean for his marriage? What does it mean for the future of the monarchy itself? And perhaps most painfully, what does it mean for the legacy of Diana, the very woman Harry swore with all his heart to honour? The answers are not simple. They are shocking, they are heartbreaking, and they are approaching with the weight of inevitability. But before we begin to unravel those answers, hold tightly to this one truth. Harry once confessed to a trusted friend late at night in a moment of raw honesty, "I never wanted to leave." That single sentence changes everything. It shifts the foundation of the story entirely. And yet, as powerful as that confession may be, it is not the end. It is merely the beginning. Because what came next would rattle Harry's marriage, his carefully managed public image, and his fragile ties to his family down to their very core. No one anticipated it, no one saw it coming, and now neither will you. What happens when the dream you were promised slowly transforms into a nightmare? That is the haunting paradox at the heart of Harry and Meghan's story. On the surface, they appeared to have it all. A royal wedding, watched by billions across the globe, international admiration, glossy magazine covers, and the shining promise of modernising an ancient monarchy. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the entire world was ready to embrace them as the very embodiment of the future of royalty. But here lies the cruel contradiction. The same dazzling fairy tale that captured the hearts of millions became the very cage that ensnared Harry. Let us rewind all the way back to the very beginning of that dream. The wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle on the 19th of May 2018 was more than a simple union between two individuals. It was a cultural spectacle, a global symbol of change and progress. A British prince marrying an American divorcee, a woman of colour, an actress who had built her own career and carved her own path together. They seemed to embody a vision of modernity that the monarchy had long resisted. The press heralded it as the birth of a modern monarchy. Crowds erupted with joy, convinced the royal family was finally stepping into a new age. Do you remember those images, Harry glowing with pride in his military uniform, Meghan gliding gracefully down the aisle in a Givenchy gown that seemed designed to make history? The world truly believed it was witnessing a love story destined to endure for generations. But was it ever really that simple? Because behind the dazzling smiles and the stage perfection tensions were already stirring. Insiders whispered that Meghan clashed with the suffocating expectations of palace life almost immediately. She bristled at the endless rules of protocol. She questioned traditions that others followed without hesitation. She argued with staff, and Harry, trapped between the woman he adored and the family that had raised him in duty, began to bend subtly at first, and then eventually completely. And here lies the bitter irony. Harry thought that marriage would bring him balance, stability, perhaps even healing. Instead, it threw his entire world off its axis. Ask yourself this. How does a man who once declared his undying loyalty to the Queen, who wore the uniform of a proud British soldier, who called the United Kingdom his eternal home, suddenly abandon all of it within only 2 years of standing at the altar and saying, "I do"? Does that sound like a choice made entirely of his own free will, or does it echo with the unmistakable influence of another? Let us draw back the curtain. The fairy tale image of Harry and Meghan was not simply crafted by palace aides or royal photographers. It was carefully, even masterfully shaped by Meghan herself. Every appearance, every smile, every photograph was part of a narrative she understood far better than Harry ever could. She had spent years navigating Hollywood, a world where image is currency, and she knew how to play that game with precision. Harry, in contrast, was vulnerable. This was the boy who grew up watching paparazzi hunt his mother Diana to her death. A boy who carried trauma he had never fully healed from. Meghan knew this. She touched those wounds. She positioned herself as the one person who could save him from history repeating itself. To Harry, it felt like love. To him, it felt like protection. But in truth, it was persuasion. And persuasion, when placed in the wrong hands, no longer looks like love at all. It transforms into control. Harry admitted in moments of private honesty that he sometimes questioned the pace at which everything unfolded, that he quietly wondered whether stepping away from the royal family was truly the wisest choice. But Meghan, sharp, determined, unyielding, always had an answer ready. She painted for him vivid and seductive pictures of a new existence, freedom under the California sun, complete control over their own story, financial independence far from the restrictions of the crown. Yet here comes the cruel twist. The freedom Harry imagined never truly arrived. Because what happens when you escape one gilded cage only to step into another? In the palace, Harry complained of rules of duty, of the constant hounding of the press. But in Montecito, he discovered himself bound in different chains, contracts, cameras, and the unforgiving expectations of Hollywood. Instead of bowing to the Queen, he now bowed to executives at streaming platforms. Instead of performing royal duties, he performed for the relentless lens of the camera. Tell me, does that sound like freedom to you? It was the dream curdling into disappointment, the dream transforming into a trap. And this is where regret quietly begins to seep in. Insiders reveal that during hushed, reflective moments, Harry confessed he missed parts of royal life. He once dismissed the camaraderie of his military brothers in arms, the stability of duty, even the rituals and traditions he used to claim suffocated him. Nostalgia has a cruel edge. You only see the value of what you had once it slips from your grasp. Yet Meghan's voice was always near, reminding him of why they left, reminding him of the press that tormented them, of the betrayals she insisted had come from within his own family. She kept the wound raw, making sure it never healed, so that Harry would not be tempted to turn back. And that, at its heart, is manipulation, keeping someone anchored in fear so deeply that they never dare question the path you have chosen for them. Think about it. If Harry had truly wanted to leave, would he now be whispering regrets? Or would he stand firm, proud of his choice, unshaken in his conviction? The very fact that he admits doubt proves the dream was never entirely his own. And that is the tragedy, because the world looked at Harry and Meghan and believed they were partners equals builders of a new life side by side. But the reality is starkly different. Meghan was steering the ship, and Harry was merely a passenger along for the voyage. Now, let us turn to the contrast between image and reality. Publicly, Harry and Meghan projected nothing but happiness. They spoke about the power of love conquering every obstacle. They smiled for the cameras with polished ease. They gave interviews filled with words about freedom, joy, and independence. But behind those staged appearances, a very different story was unfolding. Reports from those close to them painted a far more fragile picture. Harry increasingly isolated, and Meghan often frustrated, with tension simmering just beneath the polished surface. The dream the world believed in was a facade. And as with all facades, cracks inevitably began to appear. Here is something most people forget. Meghan herself once described royal life as suffocating. Yet Harry had lived within that world every single day of his existence. He knew its rules. He had come to terms with many of its limitations. What suffocated Meghan was simply ordinary life to him. She had not endured decades of tradition and protocol. She had barely given it a chance. But Harry abandoned everything he had ever known, and therein lies the cruel irony. The woman who persuaded him to walk away had only lived the royal experience briefly, while Harry had carried it in his blood from birth. You cannot sever that kind of identity without leaving scars, and those scars are beginning to show. Because when Harry whispers to trusted friends that he regrets leaving, what he is truly admitting is that the dream he was promised transformed into a reality he never wanted. It is a heartbreaking contradiction. The man who believed he was protecting his family may have actually placed them in greater danger. The man who thought he was choosing freedom may have simply chosen another kind of prison. The man who thought he was following love may, in truth, have been following manipulation. And so we must ask, if the dream was false, what comes next? Because Harry's regret is not just a private ache, it carries consequences for his marriage, for his children, for the monarchy itself, and for the sacred memory of Diana. And this brings us to the most chilling part of all. One insider claims that Harry confessed late at night, in a moment of painful honesty, that he sometimes feels he betrayed not only his family, but his mother. That, in leaving, he had gone against what Diana had wanted for him, not exile, but a careful balance between duty and freedom. That realization struck him with brutal force. And it is the kind of regret that does not fade, because if the dream was false, then the life built upon it is unstable. And instability, in time, always leads to collapse. But collapse of what exactly? His marriage carefully built, yet increasingly fragile. His public image once celebrated, but now clouded with doubt, or his ties to the monarchy, the very foundation of his identity. What lies ahead for Harry is not merely the heavy shadow of regret. It is revelation. And that revelation has the power to shake everything you believed you knew about Harry and Meghan. Because the next chapter uncovers something darker, something that proves Meghan's influence was never simply gentle persuasion. It was deliberate, it was relentless, it was crafted to leave Harry cornered, until he felt there was no other choice but to leave. And once you hear the details, you will understand why Harry himself finally admitted the decision was never entirely his own. What would you surrender for love? It is a powerful and unsettling question, isn't it? Because for Harry the answer was everything. His home, his sense of duty, his family, his heritage, even his peace of mind. But here is the cruel twist: giving all of that up was not a decision he arrived at alone. It was the result of persuasion, constant, unyielding persuasion. Let us look closely at how Meghan Markle convinced a prince, a man born into the most famous monarchy in the world, to turn his back on all of it. At first, it seemed like compromise. Like in any relationship, Meghan and Harry discussed what their future might hold. Meghan, still new to the harsh royal spotlight, confided that she felt overwhelmed. She said the press was vicious. The palace was unfeeling, that she was given no real support. And Harry, already haunted by the searing memories of his mother's suffering, felt the pain stir within him again. He wanted desperately to protect Meghan. He felt he needed to protect her. And Meghan knew precisely how to frame her arguments so that Harry's deepest wounds were torn open once more. Think about it for a moment. Harry's most profound trauma was the devastating loss of his mother Diana. His deepest and most haunting fear was the idea of history repeating itself in front of his eyes. Meghan recognised that wound and tapped directly into it. She reminded him of it constantly. She connected her own struggles with the very suffering Diana endured, softly at first, then louder and stronger, until eventually Harry could no longer separate the two in his mind. Do you see how the tactic worked? It was never only about Meghan's personal discomfort. It became about Harry's guilt. If he remained within the monarchy, Meghan implied she might one day meet the same fate as Diana. And if that happened, Harry would be to blame. That is not simply persuasion, that is emotional leverage, a powerful tool that cuts deeper than logic. Now pause and ask yourself, this was Meghan wrong to be upset about the press? Certainly not. The scrutiny was relentless, the tabloids were merciless, and the spotlight was harsh. But here lies the contradiction that cannot be ignored. Meghan entered the royal family fully aware of its challenges. She had studied it. She had searched Harry on the internet. She had watched every detail of Diana's story unfold. She knew exactly what kind of institution she was stepping into. So why then did she act blindsided? Why place herself in the role of a victim of something she had already anticipated? Because embracing the role of victim gave her power. It provided her with leverage over Harry. Each time she broke down in tears, each time she threatened that she could not endure it anymore, Harry grew more frantic, more desperate to fix the situation. And the only solution Meghan ever truly pointed toward was leaving the palace, leaving the country, leaving the family behind. Slowly, step by step, Harry began to believe this solution was his own idea. That is how persuasion is most effective, when the one being persuaded does not even realise it is happening. Friends close to the couple remember heated arguments, not the calm, supportive conversations the public imagined, but intense late-night debates where Meghan reportedly pushed with unyielding force. She framed the monarchy as toxic, outdated, even dangerous. At first, Harry resisted. He loved his military ties. He valued his identity as a prince. He was anxious about abandoning his family and the weight of tradition. Yet, Meghan always had an answer ready, always a way to transform his doubts into guilt. "Do you want me to end up like your mother?" she allegedly asked him during one particularly volatile fight. And how does a son respond to such a question? He cannot. He surrenders. And that is precisely what Harry did. Think about the power of that moment. A man defined by grief and trauma, cornered by the woman he loved, being forced to choose between the centuries-old traditions of his family and the urgent demands of his wife. Could he ever truly choose the monarchy under such pressure? Could he ever say no, without feeling as though he was betraying his mother all over again? This was the moment when Meghan's persuasion transformed into outright manipulation. Persuasion appeals to logic and reason. Manipulation, however, appeals to fear. And Meghan ensured that Harry lived in fear. Fear of loss, fear of guilt, fear of failing as a husband, fear of repeating history itself. And so, piece by piece, Harry's defences weakened. It was not one grand decision that shattered his resolve, but dozens of small ones: skip this duty, decline that event, resist this tradition, question that expectation. Each choice pulled him further from the royal family and closer to Meghan's carefully constructed vision of freedom, until finally there was no turning back. And so little by little, Harry's determination weakened until it eventually dissolved. It was never a single dramatic decision that altered his life so completely. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of smaller choices: refusing one event, skipping another duty, questioning a long-standing tradition, resisting yet another expectation. Each of these moments chipped away at his foundation, pulling him farther from his family and binding him ever closer to Meghan's vision of what freedom should look like. Until finally a day arrived when there was no return, no simple way to retrace his steps. But here lies the painful irony. Meghan had promised Harry that leaving the royal life behind would finally bring him peace. She assured him that once they stepped away, the storm would calm, the pressure would lift, and a sense of safety would emerge. Yet, according to insiders, the opposite unfolded. Once they settled in California, peace never came. Instead, the burden grew heavier. There were contracts to honour cameras to face, and a relentless demand to continually monetize their personal story. It was under that weight that Harry began whispering his regrets, realising the life he had been persuaded into living never truly matched the life he had been promised. Now comes a surprising revelation that few people are aware of. During one of the final negotiations with the palace about stepping back, Harry reportedly suggested what he believed was a reasonable compromise, a half-in, half-out arrangement. He wanted to retain part of his royal duties, continuing them on a part-time basis while also living abroad with Meghan. But Meghan dismissed the idea outright. She demanded a clean break. She insisted that compromise was impossible. And here's the crucial question: why? If Meghan truly desired balance, why not take the middle path? Why force Harry into complete exile from his heritage and duty? The answer is starkly clear. A total separation gave her absolute control. A clean break meant no palace oversight, no obligations to royal protocol, and no lingering ties that could limit her. In California, Meghan held the power to shape the narrative entirely. Within the palace walls, she never could. And Harry, caught painfully between two worlds, chose the one that ensured Meghan's happiness above all else. That was not the mark of an equal partnership. That was persuasion transforming into something far more dangerous: domination. But here is the most chilling revelation of all. Friends close to Harry confided that he later admitted he felt as though he had no real choice, that he was pushed into a corner with no escape. And when a man finds himself trapped in such a way, what does he do to cope? He convinces himself the decision was his own, that he acted of his own free will. That is how he manages to survive the weight of it. But survival is not the same as freedom. And Harry's late-night confession, spoken in a rare moment of vulnerability, "I never wanted to leave," stands as undeniable proof that he is finally acknowledging what he once tried so hard to bury the decision was never truly his. So let me ask you this. What happens when a man comes to the crushing realization that he has been manipulated into turning his back on his own blood? What happens when love, the very thing meant to liberate and uplift, becomes a heavy chain instead of wings? The answer is dangerous, perhaps even explosive, because persuasion, once exposed, does not stay quiet. It transforms into resentment. And resentment has the power to corrode and destroy even the strongest of bonds. Already Harry's regret is bubbling to the surface, impossible to hide forever. Insiders whisper of arguments behind closed doors, of long silences that speak louder than words, of moments so cold they hint at separation. A marriage built on persuasion may carry the appearance of unity for a time, but it is not a structure built to endure. And if it collapses, then what comes next? Does Harry return to his family with open hands, begging for forgiveness? Or will the palace doors remain closed to him, forever sealing the fracture in history? The truth lies in the next chapter, and it is darker still. Because Meghan's persuasion was never simply about leaving the institution. It was about division, cutting Harry off from his brother, from his father, from the very ties that bound him to his past. Once he stepped away, there was to be no easy path back. And that is precisely where the story leads. For once persuasion succeeded, the great family divide began. And that divide would push Harry to utter an even more haunting admission that he did not merely feel regret, he felt completely and utterly trapped. Trapped. That was the very word Harry reportedly used when speaking about his existence within the palace walls. But here is the question we must ask trapped by. What exactly? Was it the crown itself, the relentless expectations of royal duty, or the impossible demand to choose between his wife and his family? Because once Meghan's persuasion began to sink its roots deep, the divide was no longer simply between Harry and the institution of monarchy. It grew into something far more personal, more intimate, and more painful. It became raw conflict. It became a battle within the family itself. Let us rewind to the pivotal moments when the cracks began to widen. From childhood into adulthood, Harry leaned heavily on his brother William. They were not just princes bound by blood, they were partners in life's struggles. The heir and the spare tethered together by the tragedy of losing their mother Diana. For years they walked side by side through military service, on royal tours, in charitable missions. They were inseparable, two halves of a bond forged in grief and loyalty. But that bond began to fracture when Meghan entered the picture. Reports suggest that William, cautious and protective, urged Harry to take his time. He advised him to slow down, to truly get to know Meghan before making a lifelong commitment. On the surface, it was brotherly wisdom. But Harry did not hear it that way. To him, the words felt like judgment, like disapproval, like William was quietly questioning the woman he had chosen. And Meghan, sharp and perceptive, seized on that sliver of tension. She allegedly whispered to Harry that his family did not understand her, that they did not want her there, that they would never truly accept her. And so, the wedge was driven deeper. Have you ever watched a family argument spiral out of control? It begins as a single disagreement, but quickly grows into a cavern, each side clinging stubbornly to their version of truth, convinced the other is deaf to reason. That is precisely what unfolded within the palace walls. Harry accused his brother of failing to stand by him, of withholding support. William accused Harry of recklessness, of rushing blindly toward disaster. And through it all, Meghan stood at Harry's side, amplifying the conflict, painting herself as the outsider, the misunderstood victim, while quietly fueling the flames that set brother against brother. It was not only William who raised concerns. Charles, too, urged Harry to show restraint. He reportedly asked his son to think carefully, to weigh the long-term consequences of stepping away from the institution. He reminded him of his responsibilities, of his place in the line of succession, of the immense weight of history that rested on his shoulders. But to Harry, all of that meant little when love was on the line. And Meghan's voice, so constant, so insistent, echoed louder in his heart than his father's measured warnings ever could. Picture the dinners at Buckingham Palace, glittering chandeliers above the finest silver on the table. But beneath that grandeur lay tension. Cold stares that lingered a second too long, polite smiles that never reached the eyes, conversations that ended in frosty silence. Behind the walls of tradition and opulence, the family was splintering. And let us not forget the Queen. Elizabeth II had endured decade after decade of storms, wars, scandals, divorces, betrayals. She had guided the crown through every crisis with steadiness. Yet even she, seasoned as she was, grew troubled by the gathering tempest around Harry. Insiders say she urged him to take his time, to consider the long game, to hold fast to the delicate balance between tradition and personal happiness. But Meghan did not want balance. Balance meant compromise. Meghan wanted out, and she wanted it entirely. And so Harry, torn painfully between the woman he adored and the family that had raised him, began to drift further and further from the crown. That was when the arguments turned explosive. There are whispers of shouting matches echoing through palace corridors. William reportedly furious, Harry defensive voices raised so loudly that staff could hear through the walls. And what were they fighting about? Loyalty, responsibility, and Meghan's growing influence over Harry. William believed Meghan was pulling his brother away from everything that mattered. Harry believed William was attacking the woman he loved. Neither man would yield, and in those heated moments, the rift between them deepened into something far more permanent. Have you noticed how family fights so rarely end in resolution? They end instead with silence, with avoidance, with people turning their backs and walking away. That is precisely what happened between Harry and William. They stopped leaning on one another, stopped confiding in one another, stopped trusting the bond that had once been unbreakable. And the wedge Meghan had driven did not remain a crack, it widened into a canyon vast and unbridgeable. But the turmoil did not end there. Charles, the man destined to be king, faced a heartbreak of his own. For years he had worked carefully and deliberately to rebuild his relationship with Harry after the shattering loss of Diana and the public backlash over his marriage to Camilla. It had been a long and delicate process, one stitched together with patience and effort. Yet now, as Harry pulled further away, Charles felt the sting of betrayal not only as a father who saw his son slipping out of reach, but as a monarch watching his child abandon the very institution he had been born to uphold. And here lies the cruelest irony. Harry believed with all his heart that he was protecting Meghan from the unyielding cruelty of the crown. Yet in doing so, he was unknowingly deepening the cruelty inside his own family. Because betrayal is not always about walking away. Sometimes betrayal is quieter, sharper. It is found in the words left unspoken, in the loyalty withheld in the silence, that echoes in the very moments when support is needed most. And Harry's silence, his refusal to stand by his family in the face of Meghan's grievances, was deafening. The divide was no longer just emotional, it became strategic. Meetings were called. Palace aides worked frantically to design solutions. Could Harry and Meghan serve part-time? Could they act as royal representatives abroad? Could some compromise be found to bridge the gap? But each time Meghan dismissed the proposals, she told Harry there was only one path forward: total independence, absolute separation, no ties that could pull them back. And so negotiations collapsed under the weight of her insistence. Think of what that meant. Centuries of tradition, the weight of an empire, the Queen herself, all dismissed in favour of Meghan's demands. That was the power she held over Harry. That was the point where persuasion had hardened into control. And yet, even then, Harry wavered. Deep within, he still questioned whether leaving was truly the right choice. Insiders reveal that during one heated family meeting, he admitted something raw and painful. He felt trapped by both sides. Trapped by the crown and its endless expectations. Trapped by Meghan's relentless demands. And in that single admission lies the full tragedy of his situation. Harry was not free. He was not independent. He was not charting his own destiny. He was caught in a brutal tug-of-war, pulled by family on one side and by his wife on the other. And in the middle of that struggle, Harry broke. So, let me turn the question to you. If you were Harry, what would you choose? Would you stand with your family, the people who raised you, who bound you with duty, tradition and protocol, even as they frustrated and restrained you? Or would you stand with your spouse, the woman you love, but who pressures you to walk away from everything that once defined you? It was an impossible choice, a choice with no clean resolution, and Harry chose Meghan. But the cost of that choice was staggering. The divide it created was not just a fracture that might be healed with time. It became a canyon vast and unbridgeable, so deep that reconciliation seemed almost impossible. And yet, in the quiet of long California nights, far removed from the gilded halls of the palace, Harry began to whisper something startling to those he trusted most. He admitted that the freedom for which he had sacrificed everything felt eerily like another form of imprisonment. That, even after leaving behind duty, title, and tradition, he was not free at all. And those quiet whispers would soon harden into a full confession. Because the next chapter of his story revealed a painful truth. Life in California was not liberation. It was another cage, one Harry had stepped into willingly, but one from which he might never truly escape. What if the great escape you fought for, the escape you risked everything to achieve, turned into the very prison you once longed to flee? That is the cruel irony at the heart of Harry's journey. He left the palace behind, convinced freedom waited beyond its gates, convinced he was finally breaking the chains of tradition, duty, and the relentless eye of public scrutiny. But California was not freedom. It was confinement, dressed in a different name. Imagine the scene Montecito, a sprawling estate worth tens of millions, with palm trees swaying in the ocean breeze, privacy gates rising high to shut out the world. From the outside, it looked like paradise. From the inside, it felt like isolation, because freedom without belonging, freedom without roots, never feels like true freedom. It feels like exile. Harry believed that California would finally bring him peace. Instead, it delivered silence, not the warm, reassuring silence of family dinners, shared tradition, or a unifying sense of purpose, but the hollow, empty silence of being cut off from everything that once grounded him. Have you ever made a choice you were certain would bring relief, only to discover that the loneliness it created was heavier than the very problem you were trying to escape? That is exactly what Harry felt in those first months. The palace, for all its restrictions and rules, had also provided him with something irreplaceable: structure, identity, and connection. Without it, Harry found himself drifting aimlessly in an ocean of uncertainty, unsure of who he was, without the Crown's framework to steady him. Meanwhile, Meghan flourished. California was her terrain, her home turf, the world she had known long before she ever stepped into the royal sphere. It was the land of agents, production companies, business deals, and media networks. She knew its language, she knew how to play its game. Surrounded by people who understood her world, she moved with confidence and ease. But Harry, he was a stranger in his own life, a man transported into a reality that felt alien, even suffocating, despite the sunny skies and sprawling estate. And Meghan, determined to keep him committed, doubled down after Harry began to show cracks. Insiders claim she reminded him repeatedly of the relentless harassment by the press, the icy stares from palace courtiers, the constant disapproval radiating from his own family. She painted the palace again and again as a prison, repeating the narrative, until Harry began to echo it himself with less and less hesitation. Yet the confession lingered, because once doubt takes root, it does not fade quietly, it grows, and Harry's doubt was growing louder, impossible to conceal. The public noticed. Commentators began to whisper. Body language experts analysed his every glance and gesture. Was Harry truly content in California, or was he secretly miserable? Each time he shifted uneasily, each time his words faltered, each time his eyes dropped to the ground. Instead of meeting the camera, the suspicion deepened. And the harder Meghan pushed, the more obvious Harry's cracks became, because authenticity cannot be faked. The more forcefully you try to manufacture it, the more hollow it appears. So while Meghan thrived in the spotlight, commanding the narrative and shaping her role, Harry seemed to wither. That imbalance was undeniable, and soon it became impossible to ignore. Have you ever attended a gathering where one person holds the spotlight, carrying the conversation with ease, while their partner sits quietly at their side, smiling politely but clearly wishing to be anywhere else? That was the picture audiences saw in Harry. A man out of place, a man uncomfortable, a man buckling under the weight of a story that never truly belonged to him. And cracks like that, once visible, never remain small. They widen. They spread. That is precisely what happened next. Harry began to confide in those closest to him, long-time friends, trusted comrades from his military days, even a few loyal aides. He admitted what the cameras had only hinted at in fleeting moments. He confessed that he was not sure he belonged in California. He admitted that he missed the United Kingdom, that he longed for the camaraderie and purpose he had found in the military, that he missed the man he used to be before everything changed. These were not loud, bitter outbursts, shouted in frustration. They were soft, almost whispered confessions, fragile, yet heavy with meaning. But whispers like those carry power, because every whisper of doubt is a seed, and every seed has the potential to grow into rebellion. And Meghan knew it. She recognised it instantly. So she tried to contain it. But how can you contain something that has already slipped into the open, captured on camera for the world to dissect? You cannot. That is why Harry's slip became so explosive, because the world had seen it, and once seen it, could not be unseen. The truth was out there, and no amount of spin, no press strategy, no carefully worded statement could erase it. And here lies the sharpest irony. Harry's most authentic moment, the single moment that made him most human, most relatable to the public, was the very moment Meghan likely wished had never happened. Because authenticity, though powerful, is uncontrollable. And for Meghan, control was everything. So ask yourself this: what happens when a carefully controlled narrative begins to unravel? When an image built so meticulously starts to crumble beneath the sheer weight of honesty, the answer is clear: chaos. And chaos was already on its way. Because Harry's confession was not merely a slip of the tongue, it was a spark. And that spark lit a fire of speculation, doubt, and relentless scrutiny. And once the flames of that fire began to spread, there was no extinguishing them. Not by Meghan, not by Netflix, not by anyone at all. And what followed only confirmed it. Harry's private doubts did not remain hidden in whispered conversations or late-night confessions. They slipped into the open, spilling into the public eye. And when they did, the world was confronted with a revelation, far more startling than anyone expected. Harry was not merely a man trapped in California. He was a man trapped inside his own marriage. That realization shifted the entire narrative, because a marriage is meant to be a refuge. It should be the one place where the storms of the world cannot touch you, where love shields you from chaos, where home equals safety. Yet for Harry, that sanctuary was beginning to resemble another battlefield. The cameras caught the cracks. The press picked up on the whispers. And behind closed doors, the tension was no longer subtle. It was palpable. Harry grew restless. Meghan grew relentless. He yearned for peace. She pursued power. And those two desires cannot coexist comfortably beneath the same roof. Think about the environment Harry came from. He had grown up in a family where silence was survival, where restraint was demanded, where protocol dictated every move. You did not speak unless the crown permitted it. You did not act without the institution's blessing. You swallowed your feelings whole, no matter how heavy they were. Meghan, by contrast, had built her life on the opposite principle, on speaking out, on claiming her voice, on pushing boundaries, on daring to say what others would not. At first, those differences looked like strength. Meghan gave Harry the courage to speak when he had been conditioned to stay quiet. Harry gave Meghan the key to a stage she might otherwise never have reached. Together, they seemed unstoppable, a perfect fusion of rebellion and tradition. But with time, the balance shifted, and not in Harry's favour. He began to realise that Meghan's voice did not just stand beside his, it drowned his out. Every interview, every documentary, every speech, every public appearance. Her words dominated, while his role became increasingly reactive, supportive, secondary. And the world noticed. They no longer called them Harry and Meghan, they called them Meghan and Harry. Just a subtle shift in phrasing perhaps, but to a man who had once stood at the very centre of the global stage, it was devastating. Have you ever been in a relationship where little by little your sense of self begins to erode, where your partner's shadow grows so vast that you forget what it feels like to stand alone in the sunlight? That was the reality Harry was facing, and it gnawed at him day after day. According to insiders' arguments, behind the tall gates of the Montecito mansion became more frequent and more heated. Harry would raise questions about a contract, about an interview, about a public statement, and Meghan would swiftly cut him down. She reminded him of everything they had already risked, everything they had already lost, everything that was still on the line. "Do you want to crawl back to them?" she allegedly snapped in one fiery exchange, referring to his family. Harry had no answer, because the truth was painfully complicated. Yes, he resented the palace and the rigid institution it represented. Yes, he loathed the relentless intrusion of the press. But he also missed what he had left behind. The familiarity of home, the structure of duty, the sense of belonging that came with family ties. And Meghan could not accept that. In her eyes, longing for the past was not just weakness, it was betrayal. And that was the emotional trap. Harry was not permitted to grieve what he had lost without being accused of betraying what he had now. So the arguments did not fade. They escalated. Friends began to notice the strain. Harry appeared tired, withdrawn, less certain of himself with each passing month. Meghan, in contrast, seemed sharper, more polished, more determined, more unyielding than ever. It was as though one partner was slowly shrinking while the other was steadily growing. And here is the brutal truth. When one partner's rise comes at the expense of the other, the marriage itself begins to crumble. But it was not only about power, it was about love. Harry found himself asking a question that haunted him in the quiet hours. Did Meghan love him? For who he truly was, or for the role he played in her larger story? Because love without acceptance is not love at all. It is a transaction. And deep down, Harry feared he had become exactly that, a transaction, a symbol, a tool to further Meghan's ambition. The public began to catch glimpses of the imbalance. In interviews, Meghan would speak with passion and force, while Harry sat beside her, nodding quietly, his presence supportive but subdued. At events, she dazzled under the lights, while he lingered just a step behind. In photographs, her radiant smile contrasted with the heaviness in his eyes. And as these images circulated, the whispers grew louder and harder to ignore. Was Harry truly happy? Was he under control? Did he regret everything he had given up? These were not only questions murmured by strangers or splashed across tabloids, they were questions asked within the circles of people Harry once called, and family. Even William, despite the deep fracture between them, was said to have voiced concern in private to trusted confidants. And here is the cruel irony. The more the world speculated that Harry was trapped, the more trapped he felt. He could not admit it publicly. To do so would shatter everything the brand they had built, the lucrative deals, even the marriage itself. So he buried it. He swallowed his doubts, silenced his misgivings. But bottled emotions always have the same ending, they explode. The breaking point insiders claim came during one of their high-profile projects. Meghan pushed for full transparency, demanding another round of revelations and another public airing of grievances. Harry hesitated. He resisted. He did not want to peel back yet another layer of family secrets, did not want to pour more fuel onto the fire already burning. And Meghan pushed back hard. If we don't tell it, someone else will. She allegedly warned him, but Harry did not see it that way. For him, each new revelation felt like another nail hammered into the coffin of reconciliation. Every detail shared publicly became another barrier between him and his brother, and another reason his father's eyes might never hold pride again. And that is when Harry finally said something that froze Meghan in her tracks. "What if I don't want to tell everything?" A short sentence. Just 7 words, but devastating in its impact, because their entire empire, the memoirs, the podcasts, the streaming contracts, was built on that premise, telling everything. Without full disclosure, there was no brand, no narrative, no justification for their escape. Meghan knew this. And so she lashed out, reminding Harry of the sacrifices they had made, accusing him of weakness, pressing him with the weight of expectation. But the words had already been spoken, and once spoken, they could not be undone. What if I don't want to tell everything? That single question lingered in the air, unshakable, undeniable. And in that moment, perhaps for the very first time, Meghan realised she could no longer fully control the man she had once persuaded so effortlessly. The mask was no longer cracking only in front of the cameras, it was cracking within the walls of their own home. And when a marriage built on the illusion of perfect unity begins to fracture, the fallout is always explosive. Harry's resistance was not merely about shielding his family from further exposure. It was about something deeper, more primal, reclaiming himself, reclaiming his voice, reclaiming his very identity. And once a man starts that journey of reclaiming what he has lost, there is no simple way to reverse it, but rebellion never comes without cost. And Meghan, fiercely protective of what she had built, was not about to let Harry's doubts unravel the empire they had constructed together. So the question hung heavily in the air. How far would she go to silence him? The answer, whispered in leaks, hinted in carefully planted reports, and cloaked beneath layers of PR spin, would shock the world. Because the private battle within their marriage was no longer destined to stay private. It was about to spill out for all to see. And when it did, it revealed something far darker than anyone had expected. For months, the fractures remained disguised beneath the glossy facade of interviews, red carpet appearances, and curated images on social media. To the outside world, Harry and Meghan still radiated unity. But behind the tall gates of Montecito, the storm was gathering strength. And storms, no matter how long they build, always break. The first signs were not loud or explosive. They were quiet, almost imperceptible. A glance missed at a public event. A half smile from Harry that never touched his eyes. Meghan speaking over him in an interview while he seemed to retreat further into the background. Subtle cues, but enough for sharp-eyed observers to notice. And once the public begins to notice, the narrative shifts. Commentators who had once celebrated Harry as the brave prince who chose love over duty began to ask darker questions. Was he truly free, or was he simply under control? Tabloids splashed headlines suggesting Meghan was pulling the strings. Social media erupted with endless theories of manipulation. And here is the cruelest irony of all: the very media Harry and Meghan had sacrificed everything to escape was now dissecting not just their story, but their marriage itself. That was the moment the public battle truly began. Because Meghan, when criticised, does not retreat into silence, she strikes back, she seizes the narrative, she reframes the story. And Harry, at least in the beginning, followed her lead. Together, they launched statements, sometimes subtle, sometimes blunt, never without impact. They called out racism. They condemned abuse. They railed against injustice. And the more the press questioned their unity, the louder they declared it unbreakable. But loud declarations often conceal quiet fractures, and Harry's doubts, far from fading, only grew louder. During one interview, when asked point blank if he was happy in California, Harry delivered the expected answer about freedom, family, and a fresh start. But his eyes told a different story. They flickered downward. His voice tightened. It was déjà vu, another crack in the carefully polished mask. The audience noticed. Analysts pounced. Commentators dissected every pause, every glance. Harry doesn't look happy, they declared. And the more that observation echoed across headlines and screens, the more Meghan fought to suppress it. Behind the scenes, insiders claim she pushed Harry to sharpen his performance, to project strength, to rehearse answers, to match her confidence and fire. Because in Meghan's world, perception was everything. The brand depended on it. But here lies the contradiction. The harder they tried to prove their unity, the less people believed it. That is the paradox of public battles. They don't earn you sympathy, they earn you scrutiny. And scrutiny, once it takes hold, cuts deep. British outlets mocked Harry as henpecked. American tabloids whispered endlessly about Meghan's dominance. Social media magnified every clip where Harry appeared uneasy, every photo where his smile faltered. And then came the leaks. Anonymous sources, always described as close to the couple, began feeding the press with tales, stories of arguments, of Harry's regret, of Meghan's mounting frustration. Were they true? Were they planted? In the end, it hardly mattered. Because once whispers are printed, they take on the weight of reality. And Harry once more was cornered. He could not deny the stories without drawing even more attention to them. He could not confirm them without detonating his marriage. So he did the only thing he thought he could. He stayed silent. But in the public arena, silence does not soothe. Silence screams. And soon that screaming grew unbearable. Now let us step into Meghan's world for a moment. She had spent her entire career mastering the art of narrative control, winning over audiences, reshaping criticism into opportunity, turning stories of adversity into platforms for strength. She was not about to let whispers of cracks in her marriage dismantle everything she had so carefully built. So she doubled down. More appearances, more interviews, more speeches about resilience, about breaking free, about creating a brighter future. But here lay the problem. The more she spoke, the more people began to question whether Harry was truly speaking at all, because Harry wasn't just present beside her, he was absent while present. His face was there, but his spirit seemed elsewhere. And that absence became its own story. Here is where the darkness set in. The public battle was no longer only Harry and Meghan against the press. It began to pit Harry and Meghan against themselves. Every headline, every rumour, every anonymous leak forced them to make a choice to fight together or to fight each other. And the strain showed. Friends who once leapt to defend them fell uncharacteristically silent. Family ties frayed further still. Business partners grew uneasy. Even executives at Netflix and Spotify, the very companies invested in their brand, were said to have noticed the tension. And when corporations notice tension, they do not tolerate it, because tension doesn't sell. So Meghan pressed harder while Harry retreated further. And then inevitably it happened. During a high-profile appearance, Harry slipped. When asked about his relationship with William, he did not fall back on practiced criticism. He did not repeat the rehearsed lines of grievance. Instead, he spoke 5 simple words: "I miss my brother." 5 words. Just 5. But those words shattered months of narrative control. Headlines erupted across the globe. Analysts dissected every syllable. Was this the beginning of reconciliation? A quiet confession of regret? A spark of rebellion? And Meghan reports say she was furious. Because in those 5 words, Harry had unveiled something unscripted, something raw. He had shown longing, vulnerability, humanity. And humanity does not always fit the carefully managed script. That was the moment the public battle escalated. No longer was it Harry and Meghan against the press. It became Harry versus Meghan, with the entire world watching. Because once an audience suspects division, every glance becomes evidence, every gesture becomes proof, every silence becomes an admission. And the scrutiny crafted a picture Meghan could not erase, the picture of a prince who appeared trapped, a husband who looked silenced, a man who, though he had fled the palace, was still locked in a cage. And what unfolded next would prove it beyond doubt. Because Harry's quiet rebellion, his slips, his confessions, his longing for what he had left behind, was about to collide head-on with Meghan's relentless drive for control. And when those opposing forces clashed, the result was not just a private marital argument. It was a revelation, one so powerful it shook their marriage to its foundation, and the echoes of that revelation reached the outside world. What lay ahead for Harry was not merely regret, it was revelation. And that revelation threatened to overturn everything people thought they knew about Harry and Meghan. Because the next chapter exposed something darker, something undeniable, proof that Meghan's influence was not simply persuasion. It was calculated. It was relentless. And it was designed to corner Harry until he had no choice but to walk away from everything. And when the details surfaced, the world finally understood why Harry himself admitted, in a rare moment of honesty, that the decision had never been entirely his own. What would you sacrifice for love? It is a powerful, piercing question, isn't it? Because for Harry, the answer was devastatingly simple. He sacrificed everything: his home, his duty, his family, his heritage, even his peace of mind. But here is the cruel twist. This was never a choice Harry arrived at alone. It was the product of persuasion, of constant and unyielding persuasion. At first, it looked like compromise. As in any relationship, Harry and Meghan spoke about the future they might build together. Meghan, stepping into the glare of royal life, told Harry she felt overwhelmed. She said the press was merciless, the palace was cold, she was unsupported, even unwanted. And Harry, still haunted by the loss of his mother, felt a raw, familiar pain rising inside him. He wanted to protect her. He needed to protect her. And Meghan, sharp and deliberate, knew exactly how to frame her arguments so that Harry's deepest wounds reopened. Think about it. Harry's greatest trauma was losing Diana. His most paralysing fear was watching history repeat itself. Meghan tapped directly into that fear. She reminded him of it. She drew lines, connecting her struggles to Diana's suffering. Subtle at first, then stronger and stronger, until Harry could no longer separate the two. Do you see the tactic? It was not just about Meghan's discomfort. It was about Harry's guilt. If he stayed, Meghan implied she might suffer the same fate as Diana. And if she did, Harry would be the one responsible. That is not persuasion, it is emotional leverage. Now, pause for a moment and ask, was Meghan wrong to feel distressed by the press? Of course not. The scrutiny was savage. The tabloids were cruel. But here lies the contradiction. Meghan entered the royal family fully aware of the challenges. She had studied the institution. She had searched Harry online. She had watched Diana's story unfold. She knew exactly what she was walking into. So why present herself as blindsided? Why cast herself as the victim of something she anticipated all along? Because victimhood gave her power. It gave her leverage over Harry. Each time she broke down, each time she threatened she could not endure it anymore, Harry grew more desperate to fix the problem. And the only solution Meghan ever pointed toward was leaving the palace, leaving the country, leaving the family itself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Harry began to believe that it was his idea. That is how persuasion works best, when the person being persuaded has no awareness that it is happening at all. Friends close to the couple remember not gentle, supportive conversations, but heated arguments between Meghan and Harry, confrontations that carried the weight of high stakes. These were not small disagreements. These were battles where Meghan reportedly pushed hard, framing the monarchy not simply as flawed, but as toxic, outdated, and even dangerous. Harry resisted in the beginning. He cherished his military ties. He valued the significance of his role as a prince. He worried deeply about abandoning the family he had always known. But Meghan always had an answer, always found a way to twist his hesitation into guilt. "Do you want me to end up like your mother?" she allegedly asked him once, during the intensity of a late-night fight. "And tell me, how can a son respond to that? He cannot. There is no defence, no argument strong enough to balance the weight of that question." So he surrendered. And that is exactly what Harry did. Think about the force of that moment. A man defined by trauma, cornered by the woman he adored, forced to stand between his family's traditions and his wife's demands. Could he ever truly choose the monarchy in that scenario? Could he ever say no without feeling as if he were betraying Diana all over again? This was the point where Meghan's persuasion shifted into manipulation. Because persuasion appeals to reason. Manipulation appeals to fear. And Meghan made sure Harry was afraid of loss, afraid of guilt, afraid of failing as a husband, afraid of history repeating itself. And so, piece by piece, Harry's resolve began to crumble. It was not one monumental decision, it was dozens of small ones. Skip this duty, resist that expectation, question this tradition, decline that event. Each step pulling him farther from the family he had known and closer to Meghan's version of freedom, until one day there was no path back. But here is the cruel irony. Meghan promised Harry that leaving would bring him peace. Yet insiders reveal that once they arrived in California, peace never came. Instead, the pressure grew heavier. The contracts, the cameras, the endless need to monetize their story. That is why Harry began whispering regrets, because the life he had been persuaded into was never the life he had been promised. Now here is a twist most people have never heard. During one of their final conversations with the palace about stepping back, Harry reportedly offered a compromise, a half-in, half-out arrangement. He wanted to keep some of his royal duties on a part-time basis while also living abroad. It was Meghan who rejected the idea outright. She wanted a clean break. She insisted compromise was impossible. Ask yourself why. If Meghan truly wanted balance, why not take the middle road? Why force Harry into complete exile? The answer is simple. A clean break meant complete control. No palace oversight, no royal obligations, no strings tying them back to tradition. In California, Meghan controlled the narrative. Inside the palace, she never could, and Harry, caught between two worlds, chose the one that kept Meghan satisfied. That is not partnership. That is persuasion hardened into domination. But here is the most chilling part. Friends say Harry later admitted he felt he had no choice, that he had been backed into a corner with no way out. And when a man feels trapped, what does he do? He convinces himself the decision was his all along. That is how he survives. But survival is not freedom. And Harry's late-night confession, "I never wanted to leave," shows that he is finally admitting what he once buried, the choice, was never truly his. So, let me ask you this. What happens when a man realises he has been manipulated into betraying his own family? What happens when love transforms from wings into chains? The answer is dangerous. Because persuasion, when pushed too far, unravels into resentment. And resentment has the power to tear apart even the strongest of bonds. Harry's regret is already bubbling to the surface. Insiders whisper about arguments, about cold silences, even about quiet talk of separation. A marriage built on persuasion may not be strong enough to endure. And if it collapses, what happens then? Does Harry return to his family? Does he beg forgiveness? Or does the palace, weary of betrayal, close its doors for good? The truth, as always, lies in what came next. Because Meghan's persuasion was never only about leaving the monarchy behind. It was about something larger, something far more destructive. It was about dividing Harry from his family, from his brother, from his father, ensuring that once he stepped away, there would be no easy road back. And that is precisely where the story turns. Because once persuasion achieved its aim, the family divide began to widen. And that divide would ultimately push Harry to admit something even darker, that he felt completely, utterly trapped. Trapped. That was the word Harry reportedly used when describing his life inside the palace. But here is the question: trapped by what exactly? Was it the crown itself? Is the weight of duty? Or the unbearable pressure of choosing between his wife and his family? Because once Meghan's persuasion began to take hold, the fracture was no longer between Harry and the institution alone. It became personal. It became raw. It became an all-out war within the family itself. To understand how the cracks widened, we must rewind to those pivotal early moments. From the very beginning, Harry leaned heavily on his brother William. They were not merely princes, they were partners in life. The heir and the spare bound together forever by the trauma of losing Diana. For years they stood shoulder to shoulder through military service, on royal tours, in charitable work. They were inseparable. But the bond that once seemed unshakable began to weaken when Meghan entered the picture. Reports reveal that William, cautious and protective, urged Harry to slow down. He advised him to take time to truly know Meghan before making such a life-altering commitment. On the surface, it was brotherly advice. But Harry did not hear it that way. To him, it sounded like judgment, like disapproval, like William was casting doubt on the woman he had chosen. And Meghan, keenly aware of Harry's sensitivities, seized on that tension. She allegedly told Harry that his family would never understand her, that they did not want her among them, that she would never be fully accepted within their world. And so the wedge was driven deeper. Have you ever watched a family disagreement spiral out of control? What begins as a small difference of opinion quickly grows into a chasm, each side convinced the other is deaf to reason. That is exactly what happened within the palace walls. Harry accused William of failing to stand beside him. William accused Harry of rushing blindly into disaster. And Meghan, always at Harry's side, fanned the flames, framing herself as the misunderstood outsider, the perpetual victim. It was not only William who raised concerns. Charles, too, urged restraint. He reportedly asked Harry to think carefully about the long-term consequences of stepping away. He reminded him of his duty, his place in the line of succession, the centuries of history pressing down on his shoulders. But duty carried little weight when love was at stake. Meghan's voice rang louder in Harry's ears than his father's warnings ever could. Picture the dinners at Buckingham Palace, the gleam of chandeliers above the polished silver on the table, the air heavy with tension, cold stares, forced smiles, conversations that fizzled into silence. Behind the grandeur and glitter, the family was splintering. And then there was the Queen. Elizabeth II had endured decades of crises, wars, scandals, abdications, divorces. She had steadied the monarchy through storms that might have sunk it. But even she was troubled by the tempest rising around Harry. Insiders say she counselled patience, urging him to consider the long game to find balance between tradition and personal happiness. Yet Meghan was not interested in balance. She wanted out. And Harry, torn between the woman he adored and the family that had shaped him, began leaning further and further away from the crown. That was when the arguments grew explosive. There are whispers of shouting matches behind palace doors. William reportedly furious, Harry defensive, voices raised so high that staff could hear them through the thick walls. And what fueled these clashes? Loyalty, responsibility, Meghan's growing influence. William believed she was pulling Harry away. Harry believed William was attacking the woman he loved. Neither would bend, neither would yield, and in those moments the family divide turned irreparable. Think about how most family fights end. Rarely with resolution, more often with silence, with distance, with people turning their backs and walking away. That is exactly what happened between Harry and William. They stopped leaning on each other. They stopped trusting one another. And the wedge Meghan had driven deepened into a canyon. But it did not stop there. Charles, the future king, faced heartbreak of his own. For years he had laboured to rebuild his bond with Harry after Diana's death and his controversial marriage to Camilla. Slowly, painfully, that bond had been mended. Yet now, as Harry pulled away, Charles felt the sting of betrayal, not only as a father watching his son slip away, but as a monarch watching his child abandon the very institution he had been born to protect. And here lies the cruelest irony. Harry believed he was shielding Meghan from the cruelty of the crown, but in truth he was inflicting a different cruelty on his own family. Because betrayal is not always about leaving. Sometimes it is about silence, about the loyalty withdrawn, the defence never offered the words left unsaid. And Harry's silence, his refusal to stand by his family in the face of Meghan's complaints, was deafening. The divide did not remain merely emotional. It became strategic. Meetings were convened. Palace aides scrambled to design solutions. Could Harry and Meghan serve on a part-time basis? Could they act as royal representatives abroad? Could any kind of compromise be crafted to satisfy both sides? Yet every option presented was dismissed. Meghan insisted that compromise was impossible. She told Harry the only path forward was total independence. And so negotiations collapsed. Think about the symbolism of that moment. Centuries of tradition, the weight of an empire, even the counsel of the Queen herself, all swept aside in favour of Meghan's insistence. That was the measure of her power over Harry. That was persuasion sharpened into control. And yet even then, Harry wavered. Deep down, he still questioned whether leaving was the right decision. Insiders reveal that during one particularly heated family meeting, Harry confessed he felt trapped on both sides. Trapped by the demands of the crown, trapped by the relentless pressure of Meghan's expectations. And in that single admission lies the tragedy. Harry was not free. He was not independent. He was not choosing his own destiny. He was caught in a brutal tug of war, with his family pulling one way and his wife pulling the other. And in the middle of it all, Harry broke. So let me put the question to you. If you were Harry, who would you choose? Your family, the people who raised you but who bound you with duty and protocol? Or your spouse, the person you love but who pressures you to abandon everything you once stood for? It was an impossible choice, and Harry chose Meghan. But the cost of that choice was staggering, because the divide it created was not a mere crack. It became a canyon so vast that reconciliation seemed almost impossible. And yet, in the quiet of California nights, far removed from the palace walls, Harry began whispering something startling to those he trusted most. He admitted that the very freedom for which he had sacrificed everything felt like another prison, that even after leaving he was not free, and those whispers would soon grow louder, until at last they became confession. Because the next chapter shows us a hard truth. Harry discovered that life in California was not liberation at all. It was another cage, one he stepped into willingly, but one he might never find a way out of. What if the escape you fought so desperately for turned out to be the very prison you had tried to flee? That is the cruel irony of Harry's journey. He left the gilded palace behind, believing freedom waited on the other side, believing he could finally break free from the chains of duty, tradition, and relentless scrutiny. But California was not liberation. It was confinement with another name. Picture it clearly. Montecito, a sprawling estate worth tens of millions, palm trees swaying in the warm coastal breeze, towering gates built high enough to keep the world outside. From the outside, it looked like paradise. From the inside, it felt like isolation. Because freedom without roots does not feel like freedom at all. It feels like exile. Harry thought California would bring him peace. Instead, it delivered silence, not the gentle, reassuring silence of family dinners, traditions, and shared purpose, but the hollow silence of being cut off from everything he once knew. Have you ever made a choice, convinced it would bring relief, only to discover that the loneliness it created was worse than the burden you had escaped? That is precisely what Harry felt in those early days. Yes, the palace had been restrictive, but it was also familiar. It gave him structure, it gave him identity, it gave him belonging. Without it, Harry was unmoored, drifting through a sea of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Meghan flourished. California was her turf, her natural arena, the land of agents, deals, producers, and media connections. She was at home there. She had her networks, her allies, her understanding of how to play the game. But Harry, he was a stranger in his own life, a man lost in the very paradise he thought would save him.